My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guests Laura Petrovich-Cheney and Sage Brousseau, both of whom are associated with the extremely engaging and thoughtful exhibit entitled Weathered Shapes, Wooden Quilts, which is on display at the Boston Children's Museum until September 4th. Laura is a highly accomplished artist whose work is being featured, and Sage is a senior art educator at the museum, and she also served as the curator of the exhibit. During the program, we're learning why and how Weathered Shapes Wooden Quilts came about. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour, and in the process, we'll come to better understand and appreciate Laura's masterful creation of quilt-inspired sculptures from found, replaced, and discarded materials. Let's start by meeting Laura and Sage, and then finding out all about Weathered Shapes, Wooden Quilts. Welcome. So delighted you're both able to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the exhibit a couple of weeks ago. Eager to hear more about it and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, I think it would be of interest if both of you would just share a little bit about your backgrounds. Laura, would you please start?
Sure. Thank you. I started as a fashion designer about 20 some years ago, and then I became an elementary school teacher. And during that process, I went back for my MFA in studio arts, and now I am a sculptor, primarily an artist, but a sculptor interested in woodworking. And I mentioned the fashion background because I've always been a seamstress, always sewed and been a seamstress and interested in quilts. So this combination of sculpture and quilting is the perfect combination of what I love to do most in the world.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we'll hear much more about it and see how you've applied it shortly.
Sure.
Sage, welcome. A little bit about your background, please.
Sure. So I am also an artist and an educator, and I have background in arts education, both inside the traditional classroom, but largely in out-of-school spaces such as museums. So I have been a classroom teacher at the middle school level, and I've done a lot of programming in arts and education in community-based programs, as well as in museums, art museums, and now in the Boston Children's Museum.
Terrific, terrific. Sage, picking up on that, why and how did Weathered Shapes Wooden Quilts come about?
Yeah, so the gallery here at Boston Children's Museum is what I like to call a contemporary art space that happens to be in a children's museum, and we exhibit up to 2 artists per year. They are largely solo art exhibitions that feature one artist, and they're mostly locally based artists. So I'm usually working with artists from Massachusetts or the New England area who are currently working in all variety of media. I'm usually looking for artists who have a wealth of experience in all types of media, and who also are bringing perspectives from a variety of places. So I had gotten to know Laura's work in a previous role that I had at another museum, and I was really familiar with just the depth and the breadth of her work, and its really rich meaning, and in the ways of which visitors have engaged and experienced it. So I felt like it would be a great addition. I actually bring about 3 artists to the attention of my gallery selection committee, who are made up of both people from inside Boston Children's Museum and also professionals from the arts and culture area within Boston, including educators and curators alike. And the committee selects the artwork, really. I suggest artists that I think that would be fitting, have work that might speak to our visitors, but it's really the work of the committee to find that perfect person for the exhibit here.
Mhm. And after Laura was selected, how did you go about curating the exhibit?
It was quite easy because Laura has such a breadth of work to select from. She also did create some new work that really focuses on the idea and the concept of play, specifically child's play. So I knew that the colorful work that she already had would be an amazing addition to our gallery. And it was really exciting to see some of her newer work that speaks to play, which is something we are very passionate about here at Boston Children's Museum.
Most definitely. Well, we're going to be making our way around shortly. And as we segue to our tour, Laura, what was the inspiration? What are some of your aims for the exhibit?
This exhibit was really fun to plan. I actually have gone back to teaching part-time, and I was very much inspired by my students, particularly how they took to new materials and just created with a lot of enthusiasm that children do. And it took a lot of the pressure off of making new work when I saw how playful the children can be. They would just combine a bunch of materials together, a lot of different ideas together with abandon, without judgment. And so I kind of was extremely inspired by my students with that kind of, let's make a star with a house and let's put this in a checkerboard with this, and just give into that playfulness that we all have inside of us, but so many times we forget about it. So that's where the inspiration came from, was watching my own students, elementary art students, kind of just play and investigate. Because sometimes as an artist, when you want to make a new body of material, there's always this serious gravitas. I've got to experiment and come up with a big meaning. But sometimes the big meaning can just be investigation and ideas and abandon. And there's a fun sense of freedom with play. So that's a lot of where the inspiration came from for this exhibit.
Well, let's continue our tour and look at some of the items up close. This first one is Homeward. Could you share a little bit about your intent here, the materials used, and perhaps a little about the process undertaken?
Oh, yeah. This series actually began during COVID, during the lockdown, when we all had to stay at home. And I thought, well, what better way to stay at home than to make a home? And eventually I just sort of changed the theme. And I was very much inspired by Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers's Neighborhood. And instead of making all the houses uniform, I made them large, I made them big, I made little gardens, I made trees. And so the inspiration was about community. And each one of the homes stands for an individual, or how we're all similar and how we're all different. And this kind of idea of the differentiations between individualism and community and likeness and similarities is really played out well in this piece. And it's a lot of fun. I don't paint any of the wood. That's the first question I'm asked. And the colors that you see were the colors that were found. And that blue is the way that I found it. I never painted it. So,
before something like this comes together, what's some of your initial planning? Do you do sketches? Do you have a clear idea what it'll be at the end? Are things a surprise as you go? A little bit about that process, please.
Sure. I use graph paper. I do sketches on graph paper because graph paper is easy for me then to do the math. And I don't have to think about measurements. So if one little square on a graph paper is an inch, as I sketch, it's really easy for me to translate that back. So that's usually the first process. The second process is then there's a backing board behind these, and I draw the grid line on the back. And then I just cut the pieces. There's always surprises with salvaged wood. Some of the wood is so old that it has a bow in it. And when I cut it, it can flatten. So that flatten might change it like 1/16 of an inch, but add up 1/16 of an inch 7 times and it's a lot. And so there's always changes of how things move, how things can breathe, and wood is always living and changing depending on the humidity or the dryness. So I have to allow for that kind of livability of the wood. And so there's always surprises when things go a little wonky or a little crooked, or there's a surprise of how charming the color combinations could be.
Mhm, mhm. Well, we're gonna let viewers see a few wide shots of the layout, and then we'll zoom in and hear a little bit more about individual pieces.
Sure.
And we'll continue right here, somewhat related to the home connection, the good neighbor. What do we have here?
The good neighbor. You know, so much of art is personal narratives, and this is a personal narrative of two of my neighbors. One of my neighbors had an injury and he needed to call 911 and was unable to do so. And my other neighbor and saw a lot of drama happening. Actually, my neighbor was able to call 911 for help, but he wasn't able to call his wife to get more help. He had an accident, a physical injury. And so my other neighbor happened to see the ambulances coming down the street and thought, oh my goodness, ran out of the house to help the other neighbor, called his wife, got the ambulance, gave directions. It was the kindness was unbelievable. And so that's what this is, a good neighbor, living in a community where you look out for each other and help one another. And the stars are there because, you know, my neighbor was a star to help our other neighbor, and we don't know what would have happened if he hadn't been there at that time. And the checkerboard is just there as not as filler, but as space in between the street, the sidewalks, the places in between, as well as color interest. But the narrative to this is very personal and also has a wonderful message of being a good neighbor. What does that mean? And I thought this was perfect for the Children's Museum to think about, how do you live in community? And what does that mean? It's just not living isolated in your own house, but connecting outside, you know? And I thought that was important.
Nice, nice.
Thank you.
Well, most related, I think, very appropriate to the Children's Museum is the art of play.
Mhm.
A few words about what we have here.
Sure. This is a conglomeration of a lot of traditional quilt pieces and a few that I've made up. So you see the big stars. And again, I don't paint any of the wood. So that large star on the upper left facing side had those flowers painted on it. It was a dresser that I found on the street. And it is about just giving into wild color combinations, combining stars with squares and all kinds of shapes and colors, and just allowing my intuition to take over and not to judge, you know, to get that inner critic out of my head, because that's something that younger children don't usually develop until they're older. So can you see kindergartners and first graders just working unjudgmentally? That inner critic hasn't grown up in their heads yet. And just to play and not to judge the work, to have fun, to see what happens if I put lime green next to orange and I put it in a star with triangles. And there's all kinds of stickers that I found in the work. There's whales and Hannah Montana stickers and little bunny rabbit stickers. And I just threw it all in, and it was joyful to make. And I think some of that joy in making comes through the work, or at least I hope so.
You know, Sage, in addition to Laura's work as examples of creativity and play, another wonderful feature I appreciated and enjoyed are the written questions that we can see nearby each sculpture. Would you just share a little bit about that and the intent?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I'm always exploring within the gallery is how to engage our visitors with the artwork and how to get them to really spend some time close looking and considering what the artwork is, what its meaning might be, or what the meaning means to the individual, the viewer. And since this gallery is largely unstaffed, it's just a space for visitors to wander into independently on their own. We decided to try to have some written questions beside the work, along with the traditional label information, the artist's name, the name of the piece, what it's made of, etc. So we came up with about 1 to 3 questions for each art piece that I envisioned the adult caregivers who are bringing the children to read to the kids and question, the children they're with, to get some sense of what they think of the artwork, because a really large part of viewing art for me is really the personal experience, to look at it, consider the art, what the artist's intent is, but then also to consider how it makes you feel, or what it makes you think about or reminds you of in your own life. So that's what the intent for most of the questions were, is to really engage the visitor on a personal level.
Nice, nice. Well, let's go back to the tour. And Laura, this piece here is A Star is Born.
That's right. I was listening. Oh, I love astronomy. I love looking up at the night sky and sort of daydreaming like that. And this piece and another piece were made when the new images from NASA had come out last summer. I sort of had an inkling that I was in the running for the Boston Children's Museum. Sage and I were in conversations, and I had submitted my portfolio, but I'd started to make new work with stars in mind, or with this museum in mind. And I was very much inspired by all those new images of stars and constellations being born. I mean, those pictures were unbelievably fabulous. And so that's where this came from. A Star is Born was from those NASA images from, I guess it was 2022 when they'd come out in August. So I took my inspiration from science.
Fabulous, fabulous. Another nice wide shot as we make our way around the exhibit. And we're going to zero in on this amazing piece, I Love You to the Stars and Back, which I think is one of the maybe initial inspiration to your work that you were saying at the beginning, working with students. A few words about this background and what we see here, please.
Sure. This was done when I was an artist in residence at Wellesley School Systems. And I'd come in for a week, and the children had made the 6x6 blocks, and the parent volunteers made some of the yellow blocks. Each one of the little squares is 6 inches by 6 inches. So the entirety of this thing is 5 feet by 5 feet. It's really quite large. So I'd work with the children to get them accustomed to making a quilt and gluing. And I didn't want to necessarily bring in salvaged wood. So the art teacher at the time and I considered, what wood do children work with? And it really took us about 2 months before we realized, like, pencils. They work with pencils, and pencils are wood. It seemed so obvious that it wasn't so obvious, you know? And the children had made each one of these squares in team groups of 3 or 4. And then I took all those squares home and came up with a pattern. The pattern was my own idea. And I loved this, the little star that's in the center that is filled with all the colors. And then the larger star of the yellow pencils that, again, was primarily made by the PTO parents that really wanted to help out. So instead of having them, I had them make with their children right next to it. And I loved that multi-generational moms working with the students at the same time, but not overshadowing or interfering. They each had their own project. And then that larger yellow star sort of holds and nurtures the little star. And I just thought that was such a beautiful theme. And most of the younger students, the kindergartners, first grades, and some of the second grades made the borders, because that's where they were easiest to line up the pencils correctly together as a team. So there's a lot of teamwork in this. It wasn't always easy, but it certainly was very joyful. And it's so unbelievably fun, I think. It encompasses the idea of play and frivolity, and also a sense of seriousness. It was named after a very famous children's book, I Love You to the Stars and Back. And I just thought that that was so appropriate, how the parents really do love their children so much. And I thought that was just so appropriate.
Wonderful. And how exciting it must be for them to know that their work is hanging in the museum now.
I think so.
Most definitely. Well, let's continue. And I think we see here another example that was inspired by the James Webb telescope.
Yes, this is called Constellations. And it was looking at all those colors in a new constellation. It was magical. It was so magical. So I had to speak to that. And that's what this piece is about, the constellations and the color and little stars inside of big stars and triangles and just filled with lights and darks.
Nice, nice. And a few words about picking up the pieces.
Correct. You know, my work is about finding found wood, whether it was originally it started through Hurricane Sandy. I was living in New Jersey at the time, and so there was so much discarded wood from Hurricane Sandy. And then over the years, I found a dresser or a house was being demolished and I found wood. So I'm always looking and collecting wood. And my husband found a bunch of letter blocks and children's blocks that were given away at a yard sale. So he took them home knowing that I would find something fun to do with them. And on the back of one of them was a little truck. And I was expecting the word to be truck, but it wasn't. It was pickup. And I thought that was so funny. So I put it in there. And the title kind of reflects what I do when I find the wood. I pick it up and put it in my truck. But it's also a little play on that one. It wasn't a truck, it's pickup. And I thought that was really fun. And again, it's a combination of many quilt patterns, the star pattern, flying geese, diagonals, triangles, log cabins. There's architectural pieces in there from demolished homes that I thought was really fun. So I included those as well.
Nice. And as we come towards the end, sort of to tie things up, we have the piece entitled, Now I Know.
That's right, from the song, the ABC song, which ends, Now I Know My ABCs. I had the marvelous pleasure of seeing the collection of the Children's Museum, and Sage had asked me to sort of replicate one of their quilts from the collection. And we found this wonderful kaleidoscope pattern, and in the center was a medallion. Now, the medallion does not have the blocks in it. The medallion just has a yellow border with smaller medallions or smaller cut triangles. And I wanted to do something else, and there it is. But the collection had all these very old wooden blocks, the letter blocks, play blocks, grid blocks. So since I had all the ones that my husband found at that yard sale, I decided to line them up around the medallion as an homage to the collection, the quilt in the collection, and the antique toys that were there as well. And so that's what this is. It's a replica. And it's nice for children to sort of look for that. Where is the original? How is the original different? How is it the same? How does a wood quilt look different than a fabric quilt? So it was really a fun piece to make.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sage, what's been some of the reaction and feedback to the exhibit so far?
It's been really enjoyable to see people just kind of like rush up and take a closer look at Laura's work. I would have to say that the pencils piece has been a large favorite, overall favorite in an informal sort of assessment. I think it's just so recognizable, that human element, again, that thing that is familiar to everyone is the pencil, the humble pencil. So I've noticed a lot of people taking photographs of their children in front of that particular piece. People also really enjoy the one that Laura's standing in front of, Homeward, because again, it's just very relatable. People think about their own homes, their neighbors, their neighborhoods. And it's been really just delightful to see people recognize things, recognize children, you know, the youngest children can recognize their shapes. They know squares, they know triangles, they see that. And then adults recognize the quilt patterns as something familiar. And I also see a lot of people understanding the construction. You know, you can tell people might be professionals in the construction trades or builders or carpenters, and you can see them looking closely at her work from a sort of technical perspective and marvel at the way that Laura puts these pieces together. But overall, I think that's really nice to see people relate to them from a familiar standpoint, that we all have items of comfort, and we all have a basic understanding of connection and shapes at the very base level. We all have that understanding of color, shape, and connection. And it's a wonderful way to connect our collections objects as well, as Laura mentioned. It's great to have those items on display that people can connect to and have a familiar sense, and then see how it relates to the work in front of them as well.
Nice. You know, in addition to having the exhibit be on display for several more months until early September, I know there's some related additional programming connected to the exhibit. Could you give us just a little sense of what the general public could look forward to and perhaps participate in?
Yeah, so we do have art making here at Boston Children's Museum adjacent to Laura's exhibit in the art lab. We did do a special activity where some of our families made their own quilt-inspired works. But we're also hosting a panel discussion called The Art of Play on June 13th. And I'm going to let Laura talk a little bit more about that because she's the host of that event.
Sure.
All right, go ahead. The Art of Play.
The Art of Play. So I wanted to have a conversation with other artists about how they play with materials, play with ideas in a serious way, but also in a non-judgmental kind of fun way. How do you explore new ideas? What new narratives do you come up with? How do you silence the inner critic to just kind of let that flow go when you're in the studio? So I invited several other Boston area artists to come in and have that conversation. But I also wanted to introduce the Boston arts community to this amazing space here as well, because not a lot of people are aware that there are exhibits here. They assume children's museum, all children related, but children need to have serious conversations about art and what do artists do. And I think it's the perfect opportunity for a lot of my colleagues to come in, have conversations around play, experimentation, their craft, and also develop new ideas on exhibiting here. And so I thought that would be fantastic to have that conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank both of you so much for being here and giving us a wonderful behind-the-scenes tour of weathered shapes, wooden quilts. Definitely encourage viewers and others to make their way to the Children's Museum for this and so many other things to enjoy and participate in. All the best with future endeavors.
Thank you, Jay. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.